Good morning, everybody. I am Dr. Heather Williams. I'm the Executive Director of Personnel Services for the Riverside County Office of Education, and it is my pleasure to also serve as the ACSA Human Resources Council President. This morning, we're so pleased to provide you some timely and important information regarding AB 218 and also UTK and getting the right teachers into the right seats in classrooms. Before we get started, I just want to give you a couple of announcements, and that is if you're not an ACSA member, make sure you join ACSA. It gives you a lot of benefits, including different trainings like today. So you can always go to the ACSA webpage. In the top right-hand corner, there's a little blue button that says join, and you can join ACSA. I do want to let you know that in September, we will be holding our Personnel Institute. This is an annual conference where we get together and we have a variety of law firms and practitioners present on the latest happenings in personnel. And it's right around that time of year where legislation has just been approved and we're able to sit down and talk about what's coming our way. So that'll be in Sacramento this year, September 26th to 28th. Please mark your calendars if you're a regular attender, because it's not Wednesday through Friday this year. It's actually Monday through Wednesday. So we want to bring that to your attention. Personnel Institute, September 26th and 28th. Also, during the Personnel Institute, we always give out the Ray Curry Award for an outstanding administrator in personnel services. We're currently taking nominations for the Ray Curry Award through August 31st, 2022, and you can nominate an individual through the ACSA website. So this morning we have great information to share with you. We have over 200 people participating this morning, so welcome to all of you. I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and that the chat is disabled. But if you have questions for our speaker, you can put them in the Q&A section, and we'll be monitoring all of your questions. And as time allows, our speakers will be addressing those. The PowerPoint slides will be shared with you after the presentation. So this morning, we are so fortunate to have with us Dave George. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Schools Excess Liability Fund, also known as SOUTH. And he's joining us today to discuss the statewide impact of the California Child's Victim Act, also known as AB 218. On California public schools and what we can do to assist entities like SELF, which provide the liability coverage, to spread the importance and information on prevention, training, and as Dave and I were talking this morning, also about investigations and documentation that we need to keep for a very long period of time. Dave brings more than 27 years of risk management, risk financing, and claims administrative experience to SELF. And prior to becoming the CEO in 2019, he served on the SELF board for a decade and was elected by the board to the executive committee in 2016, becoming chair in 2017. While on the board, he held the position of executive director of risk management at San Francisco Unified School District County Office of Education. And I just want to tell you, Dave, I'm so grateful that you're here, because one of our number one priorities is protecting children and also protecting districts. So thank you for being here to discuss this timely and important topic.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Williams. And I appreciate everyone's time this morning. We have a presentation we'll pull up here and get right to it. Go to the next slide, please. So we'll just do a brief overview of AB 218. I know most of you know something about it, so we'll just do a high-level overview, a little background on SELF and just insurance pooling and how that works in California for school districts. And then I just want to highlight some, prospective problems created by retroactive laws, which is what AB 218 was. A little bit about the insurance marketplace in California for schools, fiscal impact, and where do we go from here, and how can you help? Next, please. So just a sort of primer and refresher on AB 218, we are in the midst of a 3-year revival period in which plaintiffs are allowed to come forward from any point in the past. So I've heard of districts getting claims I think the earliest I've heard is the early 70s, but there is no time limit at the moment. That does expire the end of this year on December 31st. But the second part, the second bullet there is the other piece of this, is that it also moved the statute of limitations from age 26 to age 40 in California. So it doesn't really end at the end of this year, because if you're under the age of 40, you are still able to make a claim. It deletes entirely the requirement of filing a government tort claim. So these claims move directly to litigation phase when they do come in. And initially it called for a recovery of treble damages in cases where the employer could be shown to have covered up any activity or allegations. Now, as many of you may know, public entities are not subject to punitive damages in California. So that is being challenged currently in court, that treble damages are punitive in nature, and that is currently under review by the California Supreme Court. But 2 appellate courts have sided with public entities to date on this matter. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about us. We were established in 1986. That is a pretty common start date for these insurance pools. That was a time of very tight insurance markets in California for public entities. And so public entities created their own insurance pools. And that was all going on in the 80s. So we are a statewide pool. Most are regional. You all belong to one, unless I have anyone listening in from LA Unified. They are probably the only district in the state that is not in one of the regional insurance pools. And in 21-22, just to give you a sense of our membership, our district's educated about 2.7 million California students. Next slide, please. So the prospective issues that I had touched upon related to this retroactive law in the 3 years, or really 2.5 since it passed, we've seen a significant contraction of insurance availability. And really the way the insurance companies look at it is my second bullet there, is that the rules of the game sort of change as you move along. And so from an insurance company perspective, you know, they think of states that regard the rule of law as fungible, as I put here. It creates a very unstable insurance marketplace. We are seeing an elimination of coverage for abuse and molestation in many instances, or it is severely limited. And for the retroactive claims that are coming in, so these are the claims I mentioned from the 70s and 80s and 90s, let's say. When the JPAs were formed in the 80s, remember that I said insurance was nearly absent at the time, which is why the JPAs were created. So therefore, these old claims are not insurance dollars. They're being paid directly from the pools, which in turn come from your general funds. So that is the flow of the dollars that we're seeing so far. Next slide, please. So while you can imagine there are, you know, hundreds and maybe even thousands of insurers around the globe, they all specialize in certain things. So within California, all public entities were essentially sharing 2 to 3 dozen liability insurers. And that's between cities, counties, school districts, et cetera. So since AB 218 was passed, our estimate is approximately 1/3 have left the state, or they refuse to quote public sector at all. The remainder have reduced coverage significantly, sometimes as much as half. And in addition to that, then the prices have gone up substantially. So it's really sort of a double whammy there in terms of less coverage for significantly more cost. Next slide, please. So this just gives you a snapshot of our experience. So again, remember with our ADA number, you can see we've got about half the state of California for school districts. So you can see the day before this law came into effect, we had 2 claims that had been reported to us, 6 plaintiffs, and you can see the estimated liability there. And then you can see our as of March 31 numbers there. Next slide, please. This is the additional effect that we're having. The cost to settle these claims is rising exponentially. And it's really, this number is potentially even old from when I put this slide together a few months ago, that the legal landscape is, moving on us very quickly. Next slide, please. So I don't know if any of you saw this in the paper. This was a San Francisco Bay Area case here at the end of March, but there was a case that did go to trial. This involved two plaintiffs, and I highlighted two there because when you look at that number for two persons, it's pretty stunning. So this is the landscape, and when I say it's moving quickly, this is what's helping sort of put pressure on settling these cases. Next slide, please. So what I put here is a slide, what happens in large cases like that, and while that case is under appeal, it does put pressure on just settling cases in general. So I just did sort of a simple, if it adds 50% to what the settlement cost is now, 100 and 150, et cetera, just to show how quickly the legal exposure escalates. Next slide, please. So from our end, what are we doing? So we routinely meet with legislators and through their policy analysts to discuss fiscal impact and sort of what it does to the insurance marketplace as well. What was little known about this law, it was passed by our legislature with what they call a no fiscal impact statement, which allows it to skip the appropriations committee where the cost of something is scrutinized. We meet regularly with the Department of Finance as well. As you can imagine, they have been fairly sort of understanding and receptive to the information, and they get it. We collaborate with all the risk pools in the state. As I mentioned, most are regional, and they'll cover 1 to 3 counties, depending on where in the state you are. So we do all collaborate with each other on mitigation efforts and risk management, and collaborate on training and resources that we do provide to districts. Next slide, please. And so where do we need you? And certainly this group is most key on this because it has to do with training. And as Dr. Williams mentioned, I did spend 15 years at the San Francisco Public Schools. And so I do fully appreciate that in a school district, every minute of time you have, your demands are 3, and for every dollar you have, similar. So I do appreciate that you are asked to do a lot of things. With that in mind, just the training itself, I can't emphasize enough. So when a district is sued on this, the lawsuit really is about negligent supervision. So in that sense, it's not that much different than any other type of student injury. The allegation is you didn't supervise the students properly. In this case, it has more to do with you didn't supervise your employee or staff that allowed something to happen that was inappropriate. But what really hits the district is allegations of a lack of training. And as you may know, these cases often get tried in the press. And so you end up in the front page of newspapers. And the story really is that you don't care about the safety of kids. And obviously, any of you who've worked in a district for any amount of time know that is not the case, but that is the approach and the tactic that is taken by the other side. So as you know, mandated reporter training, it has been a great start. Some things have been added to it over time, depending on the version that your district utilizes, but really more is needed. There are a lot of trainings out there. The insurance pool to which you belong will have resources. These include online and in-person resources. They are targeted to both staff and students. And from sort of my viewpoint, I would say there is a variety that is sufficient to meet both district needs and culture for content delivery. And again, as I mentioned in the beginning, certainly I recognize that districts have endless demands on your time and resources in terms of training and other things that you are asked to do. But this is a big topic and very important that we continue to make strides in further training. Next slide. So where do you get resources? If the insurance procurement is not within HR, then identify what insurance pool your district is part of. As I mentioned, unless you are LA Unified, anybody on the call, you are in an insurance pool of some variety. They all will have resources, and so that is the best place to start, and they can let you know what is available and what the different options are. And then certainly you can also reach out to us. We are happy to help or get you pointed in the right direction in terms of what your specific insurance setup is and what membership you have. And I think that, yes, that is the last slide. I'm certainly happy to answer questions if there are some in the Q&A, or if you'd like to do it offline in a further email or call, I'm happy to do that as well.
Thank you, Dave. As we're waiting for some questions to come in, obviously there's a trend in these cases increasing and claims increasing. Do you see any rise in that trend continuing, or do you see it stabling off after December 31st?
That is the magic question that we're trying to get our hands around. I do see it tapering off after December 31st. I think the 3-year window will be sort of the vast majority of them. But again, lots of people coming forward are not yet age 40. So we're seeing that pattern as well. And so I do think we will continue to see some, but I think not at the rate.
Okay. You talked about the cost of these claims if they go to a jury trial, and that there's a lot of pressure to settle. I recall a district a few years back who were being asked to settle for about $350,000. This was before AB 218. And they thought it was extreme, and they took their chance on a jury trial and got a settlement of $7 million, which was quite shocking. So if districts are in this situation, there's a claim and they're considering a settlement, what's the average settlement that these cases are settling for?
So we certainly have seen it exceed $1 million per plaintiff pretty quickly within just a short period of time. So, and again, part of the difficulty in that particular issue is that the range of allegations is quite wide. And so I think, we often think about what we see in the paper, or maybe what have been going on with religious institutions, et cetera. Those aren't necessarily the pattern of public school claims, because the environment is very different, as you can imagine. And so, but you sort of get the value of the cases gets mixed in with sort of what's going on nationally and with any type of entity in the state. And so, when people read about the gymnastics cases or some of the large university cases, you as a K-12 or a K-8 get put into that same conception within people's minds. And that is the pattern we're seeing in terms of the cost.
Right. So is there any by the legislator to maybe extend that deadline past December 31st, or is that a hard deadline?
We were concerned there was going to be legislative effort. We have not seen that yet. So we do believe it's a hard deadline. And there was about 36 states that extended their deadline. So this was not unique to California, but no one did it for 3 years. So we had the longest open window to begin with. And I think that helped minimize that pressure to extend it.
Okay. Now, in your presentation, you talked about the drop in coverage for these types of claims. Just for our viewers, can you explain a little bit more about why there's a trend to drop coverage?
So the first piece specifically has to do with, so remember, normally you have to file a claim against a public entity within 6 months. This one has no claim filing requirement, and you can file a claim until you're age 40. So insurers have a very hard time pricing something that has a 22-year potential of a claim. And so that drives them away and says, we can't give you a price because we don't know, right? You have 22 years, we could be stuck with you. That's sort of how they view it. And that's just a very hard business proposition. So they either eliminate the coverage for the abuse and molestation, or they just won't insure you for anything. Those are sort of their two ways of handling that.
And districts who haven't had this experience yet might not realize that they are still responsible for some of that money. So if it's let's say we do $1 million settlement, what percentage of that is covered by insurance and what percentage of that is coming out of general fund for the district?
It varies a lot by year. The older those claims are, from the 80s and 90s, it is typically self-insured, so coming directly from districts. As you get into the more modern years, say past 2000, maybe as much as 3/4 is insured and maybe 1/4 is coming. What we're finding here, the volume of claims, no insurance policy is limitless. So they might cover you for 2 or 3 claims. And then after that, it becomes self-insured again. So it's kind of all over the map in terms of where this is coming from. But even the self-insured part is significant.
So let's talk about training for a minute, because we may have some risk managers on this call, but most people are going to be like me. They're going to be in charge of personnel or working in personnel. So we're in charge of doing those annual notifications every year, making sure our employees are trained. What's the best way to document not only the training, but the people that participated, to make sure we're protecting ourselves in the event that a claim does occur?
So the best way, I think, is really how you may document other trainings, simply that you have a record of who and when it was done, the amount of time, and generally that you would have available either the content so that you could show what was in the training.
Great. I think that's important. I know sometimes I'll keep dates, times, and sign up sheets, but not always the content, because I'm relying on, our third party that sells us the content to have that. But if this claim comes down the road 40 years from now, we might need to think of a way to keep that content on file.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. So one of the key roles that personnel does is investigate allegations of misconduct when they come in. So before a tort claim is even filed. When we're doing that investigation, is there anything that you think we really need to consider to document or have on file in the event that a claim is filed later?
Really just, again, good documentation about the investigation. If it's not already part of it, is to ensure that CPS or the authorities have been contacted by the appropriate persons. One pattern that we have been seeing, and you can imagine what this does to your teachers, they are routinely being brought into these lawsuits for a failure to report to CPS. And so that causes a lot of anxiety internally, and they'll pull in, I've seen it, every teacher at a school, whether they were even remotely sort of related to this incident or not. And so just really making sure that anyone who needed to report, that it's been done.
Thank you. And do you have one last question for you, Dave? In addition to the mandated reporter training, do you have examples of other training that districts might use?
Yeah, there are a few examples out there, and both, again, for staff, but also for the students. And so I think The ones I've seen that I feel like maybe have the best traction, if you will, have to do with school climate. And this is really a lot of the stuff we've been seeing across the board. So school climate, the bullying, speaking up for yourself, really all those things, this is all tied together in terms of awareness. So those have been the ones I feel like have been the most sort of useful in terms of the awareness and sort of speaking up. I think if I had anything, the bottom line, the speaking up piece, and that's really for both. You know, no one likes to think this is going on in a school environment because this is so against how an educator comes to their job that I think sometimes there's just a blind spot potentially that could arise because educators aren't taught to think this way.
Right. I think that's so important, Dave, as we close up with your part of the presentation is, you know, I sat for my risk manager one year in a trial because he wasn't able to be there, and just watched one teacher after the next get pulled up to the stand and have to say, yeah, they were aware something didn't feel right, but they didn't report. They didn't call CPS. They didn't tell anybody. And so it's just that reminder that child abuse isn't just people in the child's family. It could be a staff member, it could be a custodian, could be a teacher, could be an administrator, and just the importance of reporting that and, you know, also contacting personnel so it can be dealt with. So yeah, thank you, Dave, so much for being with us this morning and for your very important information. We really appreciate you.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate everyone's time.
Thank you, Dave. All right, so personnel administrators across the state. Next, we have joining us Emma and Hannah from the Learning Policy Institute. So there's Hannah. Good morning, Hannah. And I think Emma has joined us too. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about workforce data and credentialing pathways for transitional kindergarten. I know this is a hot topic for all of us because there's some local education agency kind of authority on how teachers can get placed in those classrooms. So I just want to introduce Hannah and Emma and let you know that the Learning Policy Institute is a nonprofit organization that conducts and communicates independent, high quality research to improve education policy and practice. And just to put a plug in for them, if you're not on their listserv, get on their listserv because I get emails from them all the time about timely and important information. The Institute connects policymakers and stakeholders at the local, state, and federal levels with evidence, ideas, and actions needed to strengthen the education system from preschool to college and career readiness. Today, as I mentioned, we're joined by Hannah and Emma. Hannah co-leads LIP's Early Childhood Learning Team. Her work centers on policies that improve early learning systems in California and other states, particularly preparing a high-quality, diverse educator workforce. And Emma is a senior researcher at LPI, and she has extensive research experience in the fields of economics of education, education policy, and quantitative methods. So ladies, I just want to welcome you and thank you. We have about 175 people on the call today, anxious to hear more about UTK and how we can best serve our students. So ladies, take it away.
Great, thank you so much. Oh, great, thanks, Philip. So I'm Hannah Melnick, Senior Policy Advisor at the Learning Policy Institute. And as mentioned, I'm joined by my colleague, Emma Garcia, Senior Researcher at LPI. We're here to be talking about building a well-qualified early educator workforce and with a specific focus on TK, Transitional Kindergarten. If you can go to the next slide. Today, we're going to be talking about findings from a forthcoming report that Emma and I have written with our colleague, Melanie Lung Gagne. We're going to start by talking about projected TK teacher demand, the number of teachers we think will be needed over the next 5 years, the ways that the possible candidates for these teacher positions and pathways for them to take into the profession. We'll share some recommendations and have time for Q&A. And we're really hoping that you'll walk away with a better understanding of the magnitude of the coming TK teacher demand, and then be able to identify specific pathways for different candidates into TK and other ECE teaching positions. So next slide, I'm going to now pass it over to Emma, who's going to talk about the projected TK teacher demand.
Thank you, Hannah. It's great to join all of you today. We very much appreciate this opportunity. So I'm going to focus on presenting the results of our TK workforce demand analysis, which shed light both on the magnitude and the urgency of the needs that were just mentioned. Hannah will explain the different poles of teachers and pathways into teaching TK. I will also briefly mention the policy context in which the TK expansion is taking place, and then turn onto projections of eligible children population, enrollment, and lead and assistant TK teachers afterwards. Next slide, please. So without further delay, as you know, TK will be phased in rapidly over the next 4 years. During this time, each year eligibility will expand by 2 to 3 months, as shown in this table. In addition, although subject to new funding, new ratio requirements will be mandated. Starting next year, ratio will be 12:1, to be followed by a more reduced ratio of 10:1 the years after. So having a high quality program will depend on having not only these ratios and other quality parameters, but also very critically on having a high quality workforce. And thus California needs to find enough qualified teachers to teach a growing number of children. TK expansion is happening at the same time the state preschool is expanding too. So it's actually the ECE system writ large, the one that will be needing more teachers. Next slide, please. This graph shows the projected TK eligible population. Nearly 500,000 children will be eligible for TK when the program is fully implemented. Please note that this series does account for decline in population in California over this period of time, which according to the Department of Finance population projections will be of about 11% for the children in the TK age groups between 2019 and 2025. Participation in TK will still be voluntary, so not all these children will be joining TK. And parents will continue to have the possibility of using other subsidized preschool options that may have better ratios or that are a better fit for reasons such as the cultural or the language match, the hours, or just because they run full year. Enrollment will be also shaped by district's ability to open classrooms. Next slide, please. This, of course, creates uncertainty about the enrollment trends as we move forward. We primarily address uncertainty in this study by offering a likely range for enrollment. In short, our range considers 3 scenarios for enrollment: a low uptake, a constant uptake following pre-pandemic values, and a high uptake. The mid-range is the constant uptake. In that scenario, we assume that enrollment will grow following uptake rates observed in the baseline year, which was 2019-20. To be more precise, and details are in our report, in each county, the uptake rate observed in the baseline year will stay constant through full implementation. For reference, the share of enrolled to eligible for California statewide that year pre-pandemic was 71%. Please note that we use 2019-20 as the baseline because that year is not affected by the significant changes to enrollment during the pandemic. Actually, the CD data released last spring showed a sharp decline in enrollment in California with about 20,000 fewer students in TK, and that those trends were observed and true in most states actually. For the lower bound scenario, we assume an uptake of 60% through 2024-25 with an uptake to 65% in the last year. These values could be seen as modeling a slow recovery of enrollment post-pandemic. The upper bound assumes uptake equal to 75% through 2024-25 with an uptake to 80% in the last year. These values would be observed if California followed what has been observed for other UPK in other states. Next slide. This figure that we are seeing now shows projected enrollment under the 3 uptake scenarios. We estimate that TK enrollment will increase fourfold by full implementation, ranging from 2,090 to 360,000 students. Over 300,000 students actually in our mid-range scenario as well. Next slide. Uptake or participation in the program is only one of the assumptions we need to make. To move to projected demand, teacher demand, we compute the number of TK classes needed by dividing enrollment by class size. Our class size parameters take into consideration the ratios that we saw and how LEAs will staff classes to meet the ratios. Also prior data on class size and the fact that not all classrooms will exactly have the maximum number of children per class. That's something that we call enrollment efficiency. We assume that class size will be equal to about 22 through 2022-23 and to 18 afterwards. We also have simplified assumptions for the use of combo classes, partitions, attrition, and others, but we also offer sensitivity analysis showing how this could affect the results in the report. Next slide, please. As you will see in a second, we have three workforce projection trends following the three enrollment scenarios. The figure shows the number of additional TK lead teachers relative to the baseline. So on top of the 4,100 teachers we started off with, we would need between 11,900 and 15,600 additional lead TK teachers by full implementation. Put more simply, the TK workforce is expected to multiply by 4 between 2019-20 and 2025-26. It's not shown in this graph, but the total number of assistant TK teachers demanded will be between 16 and 20,000 and likely more. Next slide, please. There is significant regional variation in uptake, and therefore there are significant differences in hiring expectations and needs across countries, actually across districts as well, though that's not shown in this map. The needs for additional teachers are a function, of course, of size, but also depend on other preschool options that might be available and on uptake prior to the program's universalization. It's not represented, but it's very important to highlight the regional variation in the challenges districts may face in preparing, recruiting, and retaining the lead and assistant teachers the TK program will need. Given this, Hannah will discuss the pathways into joining the TK workforce. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Emma. So as Emma mentioned, this is a huge demand, about 12 to 15,500 lead TK teachers and even more assistant TK teachers. So we'll talk through kind of what are the requirements and take some questions in chat about that, and then potential pathways. Next slide. So I think probably you're relatively familiar with the requirements to teach in TK, but to make sure everyone's on the same page. The statute for transitional kindergarten says that it's an adult to child ratio. So when we're talking about TK assistant teachers, we are talking about that other adult in the classroom to bring the ratios down. But in an early childhood classroom, that adult has a really important instructional role. So in Title I classes, since they're assisting in instruction, we believe that those adults will need to be paraprofessionals, which means neither need to have an associate's degree, 48 units of college, or pass an assessment of basic skills and pedagogy. We also, to be a lead TK teacher, a teacher currently needs to have a multiple subject credential and also have early childhood expertise. So that means 24 units of early childhood courses, child development teacher permit, or equivalent experience as determined by the LEI. Next. So I also just want to flag that some of you may have been following what's been happening at CTC last week. They decided to continue to forward with the development of a preschool to third grade ECE specialist credential. If that credential is adopted this year, then programs could be accredited and start offering programs in to offer this credential as soon as fall of 2023. And that would be in lieu of the multiple subject credential and the 24 unit requirement. Next slide. So the potential, who's going to fill these potential TK positions? We're going to talk through 3 candidate pools. The first is multiple subject credential holders. The second is current early educators who already have a bachelor's degree. And the third is early educators, classified staff, and other candidates who don't yet have a bachelor's. Next. So the first group, your multiple subject credential holders, we're thinking about the ones who don't yet meet the early childhood expertise requirement, those 24 units of early childhood or equivalent. These include your elementary school teachers, but also out-of-state credential holders, which we want to highlight as an important pool because they make up about 16% of new entrants to the teaching workforce in California each year. LEAs can help to organize and fund cohorts of teachers to take early childhood units at community colleges or at institutions of higher education where those 24 units build potentially towards a master's degree in early childhood to make it a little bit more attractive to candidates and can really build their early childhood expertise. We would really encourage you to work together with your county offices of education and institutions of higher education to make that coursework more accessible and relevant to your current teachers. For example, fielding courses on your campus, having them available after school hours, et cetera. And we also would really encourage you to think about following up that coursework with coaching and in-service professional development to build the direct connection with the work that teachers are doing in the classroom. Next. Oh, and I also just see there's a question about what is equivalent experience. So that is determined by the LEA, and I think CDE is probably going to be working on providing some guidance as to what would count as early childhood equivalent experience. So for experienced early educators with a bachelor's degree, they're another key group of potential candidates for early childhood positions. Many are poised to earn a teaching credential. There are 41,000 early educators in California that already have a bachelor's degree, even though it's not required in almost most early childhood programs. That's about half of our early childhood teachers across the state. And 29,000 of them additionally hold a child development teacher permit, and subsequently 17,000 of them have 6 or more years of experience. So again, this is an experienced and pretty qualified pool when you look statewide. They also earn significantly less than TK teachers, meaning that TK jobs are going to be particularly attractive to this workforce. Recent data from the Center for the Study of Childcare Employment shows that they earn about half of a TK salary on average in early childhood positions. And I also want to point out that they're more diverse workforce than the TK-12. You have 66% of center-based early childhood teachers being people of color, compared to 39% in TK-12. So if you look at the graphic on the left, this shows some different pathways that early educators might take into TK positions. The first is your traditional post-baccalaureate teacher prep program. Candidates could take those classes while working in their current positions. And I want to note that institutions of higher ed can waive coursework for, not waive, they can credit coursework that candidates have already taken. For example, if they were a child development major doing their BA or their clinical experience that they already have. Residency programs in which the candidate is working alongside a mentor teacher for a year while taking coursework is another good option. If it's in a TK classroom, the resident could potentially be employed and be earning wages as a TK assistant teacher. And finally, intern programs will be really important to consider. We don't necessarily always recommend internships, but for experienced early educators with a bachelor's, it might make sense, especially if the district is providing onboarding and support and coaching alongside the coursework. And I just want to also flag that if the early childhood specialist credential is adopted, there might additionally be some other expedited pathways for this candidate pool. For example, only having candidates take the K-3 coursework if they have 6 or more years of experience. Next slide. So finally, candidates who don't yet have a bachelor's degree but are really poised to work towards becoming TK lead teachers, or in the shorter term, being assistant TK teachers. These include experienced early educators. About a quarter of them statewide hold an associate's degree, so that means they're about halfway through the bachelor's degree process. Recent graduates of early childhood associates programs, there are about 6,000 issued annually, so another pretty large supply pool. Paraprofessionals in your districts, as well as high school students who have dual enrolled or are interested in dual enrolling in ECE or child development coursework while in high school. So on the right, you'll see the potential pathways they might take. Bachelor's degree programs, obviously, we suggest having candidates take coursework together in cohorts that can help increase retention, help students support one another, and it can also, that can be, the districts can aid in that by helping to form cohorts and bringing coursework to them. One example that you're likely familiar with is the classified school employee teacher credentialing program, which offers about $24,000 per candidate to earn their bachelor's degree and their teacher credential. Another more expedited pathway is the integrated teacher preparation program, in which candidates can earn their bachelor's degree and their teaching credential in 4 years, hoping to see more of these programs with some new funding in the budget. And these programs can start often in community colleges in the 2+2 model, which are more affordable and often accessible. And then not shown here is obviously dual enrollment pathways. There's potentially is going to be some new funding for that in the budget as well, with a focus on taking early childhood and child development coursework. Next. Here are some potential sources of funding. These slides will come out to you, and each of them has a link so you can learn more. The one I'll flag right now is the Golden State Teacher Grant Program. This is the one funding source that goes directly to candidates. It's up to $20,000 per teacher candidate to earn their teaching credential. We really recommend that you work with candidates to help them apply. It's a really important funding source, although we've heard that the application can be somewhat onerous. And the other funding sources go directly to LEAs. For example, almost all LEAs get the California Pre-K Planning and Implementation Grant. So again, working with your county office to think about how to access some of these grants and use them for this purpose. Next slide. So we have several recommendations in our report, but the ones that are most relevant for LEAs, the first is clearly communicating career pathways into TK and other early childhood jobs. We have heard substantial confusion in the field about what it will take to become qualified to teach TK. It's not being made any easier by the fact we're developing a new credential as we speak. So really encourage you to work with your county office, work to think about a communication strategy. Santa Clara County Office of Education, for example, is working with several LEAs and IHEs to think about how to communicate pathways to different groups of candidates. Next, developing high quality TK preparation programs in collaboration with your county offices and higher ed. We really want to make sure that pathways are accessible to diverse groups of candidates. A couple of examples, Placer County Office of Education is helping LEAs field cohorts of candidates to take community college coursework to earn their early childhood units to become qualified to teach TK. Another example, San Diego Unified is working with Laverne University to help fund some low-cost and accessible pathways for their classified staff and their state preschool teachers in the district to become qualified TK lead teachers as well. Next. We want to ensure that assistant TK teachers, again, that extra adults in the classroom, has access to pre-service and in-service professional development. They are not required to have child development units going in, but it's really, really important. Assistant teachers in early childhood classrooms play an important instructional role because individual classes are really individualized in early childhood. So what that adult does is very important. So making sure that they have access to the same content that lead teachers have, and also thinking about them as a potential pool of candidates for lead TK positions as well. Next. Finally, we want to consider the development of the broader early childhood workforce beyond TK. As Emma mentioned, state preschool and actually childcare as well are expanding at the same time. So we want to think about transitional kindergarten within the universal preschool framework, alongside Head Start, alongside community-based preschool programs. So whenever possible, working together with others in your community, for example, those working in your local planning council, to consider kind of how to build up the workforce writ large. So with that, we can move to questions. Just want to flag that we have a link to a TK residency brief that was written by our colleague Kathy Yoon, and we'll soon have our TK workforce report out with county level projections that of the data that Emma presented. I know there's several questions in the chat that I wasn't able to follow.
That's okay. I will help us get through the questions, Hannah and Emma. Thank you so much for that valuable information. One of the questions had to do with, local education discretion. And you mentioned that maybe some more information would be coming out about that. I know that's a hot topic for districts right now, and they're really concerned about what might that look like. Have you heard what some districts are doing as far as the flexibility for local education agencies, just so we can share ideas with the people on the call?
And flexibility in which sense?
As far as them being qualified to teach in the TK classroom.
Got it. So I think, for lead teachers, they need to have the 24 units or equivalent experience by August of 2023. And I think the law is pretty clear that TK apportionment would only go to programs that meet those requirements. But there are several options to have teachers working toward their credential requirements as well while they're working.
Then we have a question about the assistant teacher. This individual is talking about, they watched a previous webinar from CDE that mentioned the second adult only needed to be just that they didn't need to have any specific qualifications. But from your presentation today, it looks like they need to have at least 60 units or pass an assessment. Can you just talk a little bit further about that?
Yeah, so we were looking into this, and I think CDE we have to provide some clarification. Our understanding was that in Title I schools, any person who is offering instruction has to be a paraprofessional, and you all would know better the requirements in your districts for paraprofessionals, but they would at least need to pass a local assessment of basic skills.
We have a question. Will an expired CD permit meet the early childhood expertise, or does the permit need to be valid?
I don't know. That's a good question for CDE. I don't know how, I think it has to be a child development teacher permit. So I think there has been some question about that. So having the 24 units will be important. And then on the expiration date, I don't know.
So teachers who hold an early childhood special ed credential, do they also have to meet the early childhood expertise if they're assigned to a TK SDC assignment?
That is another really good question. I haven't actually seen very much about early childhood special ed, but I know that there is a big push to have inclusive classrooms. So another good question for CDE to clarify.
Okay. And then could a district's local committee on special assignments seek board approval for TK teacher candidates to meet these requirements? And what local control do districts have to waive requirements?
That is something, so again, I don't know specifically about the local laws and how those would pertain, but I know that's something that's being taken up by CTC in the early childhood specialist credential, the local assignment option. So we can also share the link to the most recent agenda item to follow that, and then would have to clarify with CTC.
Okay. So for TK teachers with years of experiences, that is at the LEA discretion. Does the LEA need to complete any form or upload any information or evidence to CDE, or just keep a record of that at the district level?
To my knowledge, they don't need to send that information to CDE because we've been trying to track down how districts have been defining experience, and there aren't any collected data on that. It might change.
Okay. I think this is something that I'll be working with Dorothy and Saret on at ACSA and see if we can maybe get CDE with us at one of our next live webinars to answer some of these questions. In the meantime, do we have any other specific questions for Hannah or Emma? Just looking through it real quick. There's a question about the slideshow. I believe ACSA will have your presentation available to distribute to attendees. There's a question about the 1-to-10 ratio. Do we know if there's any chances of funding being passed for that 1-to-10 ratio?
I feel like I'm going to become a broken record with that. Don't know. I think I will just say that it's, I think, quite important that the state and districts try to move towards that because it's what professional standards nationwide. 12-to-1 is really high in early childhood classes, but who knows what's going to happen with the budget over the next year.
Okay. Well, ladies, I just want to say thank you for your time today. This is a hot topic. As you can see, there's a lot of questions and there's a lot of still, we're not quite sure yet. And so we're all working it out. We appreciate you sharing the information that you do have. It'll be very important to our districts as we meet the needs of our students statewide. And we can appreciate your continued advocacy. As you know, when I see the numbers of needing up to 16 to 20,000 TK teachers across the state in the coming years, when we're having difficulty meeting the demands of hiring teachers right now, this is going to be a challenge ahead of all of us. So we appreciate your input and all the research that you do. So thank you, ladies, again. This does conclude our presentation for today. So to all of you who joined us, thank you very much for being part of this. We look forward to continuing at the ACSA HR Council and serving you in the future with hot topics like this. And just a reminder to join ACSA if you haven't already, and we will see you at the Personnel Institute in September. Have a great day, everybody.